Excellent. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. We'll be beginning the plenary in just a moment. Thank you all for coming this afternoon, and just as an opener, we would like to thank the International Institute of Space Law for allowing us to come and speak today, most especially Dr. Nandi Jacintuliana, and of course President James Zimmerman, and Dick Klein as well from the IAF, who helped put this together for us. And we would be very remiss if we didn't mention Victor Reglero, the chair of the host city of Valencia, for these beautiful facilities today. Now, today, it's going to be a panel. It's Enabling the Frontier, the Regulatory Challenges to the Utilization of Space. We're going to be doing things slightly differently than the IAF normally does. There will be no presentations. There will be no talks. We're just going to go straight to questions. First few questions from myself, the chair, and then, as time allows, questions from the audience. One thing I would ask is that if you do have a question, please keep the question short, keep it concise, and please don't make a statement. We don't have too much time today, and we wish to try and finish on time. And with that, let me please introduce you to our panel, who we're very fortunate to have with us today. On my immediate right is Art Dula. Art is the CEO of Excalibur Almaz and also a professor of space law at the University of Houston in Texas. A leader in the field of space commercialization and space law, Art has been integral in the establishment of many space firsts for SES Global, one of the world's largest satellite operators. John, in his daily work, supports transactional and investment activities. For example, the recent acquisition of New Sky, and congratulations on that. A lot of work went into that. John is based out of London and Bertsdorf in Luxembourg, and he has been in the industry since 1997, formerly with GE Americom, and then in 2001, with the merger there, or corporate purchase, has been with SES Global. Thank you for coming, John, today as well. Next to John, we have Dr. Professor Frans van der Vank, who is the Director of Space Law and Research at the International Institute of Space Law at Leiden University. He's been there since 1990. He has served as an advisor to the Dutch government, various foreign governments, the European Commission, ESA, the UN, the OECD, and several national space agencies on space policy and law, and specifically focused on the commercialization of space and privatization issues. He was given the Distinguished Service Award of the International Institute of Space Law in Vancouver in October 2004, and he is inter alia Director and Treasurer of the IISL, a member of the Board of the European Centre for Space Law, and a member, of course, of the IAA. Next to Frans is Clay Mowry. Clay is President and Chairman of Arianespace, Inc. Clay has served for the past 5 years as President of Arianespace, Inc., the US subsidiary of the European launch services provider Arianespace. Prior to his current role, he spent 6 years as the Executive Director of the Satellite Industry Association, an organization which represents the US commercial satellite operators and manufacturers. Before leading the SIA, he spent 5 years with the US government with the International Trade Administration, specifically focused on commercial satellite and launch trade agreements. And last but by no means least is Dr. Christian Salaburger. Now, Dr. Salaburger has very kindly joined us today. Ms. Indra Heed, a counsel at MDA, was supposed to be with us. Unfortunately, due to a family illness, she sends her regrets and her apologies. But we are most fortunate to have with us Chris. Chris Salaburger, as you know, is Vice President of Space Exploration and Advanced Systems at MDA. Before coming to MDA, Chris served both with the Canadian Space Agency and the European Space Agency. Chris is also presently Vice Chairman of the Board of Trustees at the ISU and also a member of the IAA. Now, with that, and with those brief introductions, and we're very lucky, what we've tried to do today is actually have a panel from the satellite industry, the launch vehicle industry, people working in new space endeavors, people working in space exploration, and also leading academics in the field of space law, to try and come together and, quite honestly and openly, talk about some of the regulatory issues that we see as hindrances or challenges to the progression of the space exploration, and also the commercialization and use of space. Now, with that, I'll take my chairman's prerogative and launch into the first question. Stop turning away from the mic. This year marks the 10th anniversary of the unfortunate accident with the Long March vehicle that led to the revision of the US export control laws that we now call ITAR today. Now, that was actually happened 10 years ago, 1998. Changes were made, and that's led to our present regime. And so what are the effects of ITAR on the industry? Almost 10 years, or 8 to 10 years of the problems we've been facing. Is it good, bad? Is it getting better? Are people trying to, address the challenges? Is it getting worse? How is it affecting your businesses? And more importantly, what needs to be done to fix this issue? I don't know if anyone, Clay, maybe you'd like to lead off on that one.
Sure, I'd be happy to start. I guess I can say that I think the ITAR issue more recently, that is in the past year or so, has gotten worse. The sessions I've been to with a number of the U.S. companies that end up applying for these licenses, all of them have said that the periods for getting licenses processed through the State Department, through the DDTC office there, and the monitoring that's done by the DITSA group at the DoD, this period is extended from somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 5 months to something on the order of 6 to 7 months these days. It takes longer to get TAAs processed now, and it's been overall a much more difficult task. I think for all companies, we're having to do much more advanced planning to make sure that we can interact in the commercial satellite world to have this done. Now, that is to say, I don't want to sound like I'm coming off as denigrating the job that the State Department and the Defense Department do. The people that work in these positions are very dedicated people. They're working very hard, but they're simply overwhelmed, quite frankly, with what the task in front of them. There's not enough funding. There's not enough staff. In my discussions with people at both those offices, they've told me that they've had to take a lot of people and focus them on the Iraq war, quite frankly, and efforts associated with that. So they get a lot of people that are detailed from the military into those offices, and they've had a real challenge. So overall, I think the picture is getting worse these days, and I would say it's across the board in the space industry that it's impacting operators, manufacturers, launch companies like ours. Even though we don't apply for licenses, we're on the receiving end of a lot of these TAAs, and we've seen a lot of delays from our customers. I would say on the monitoring side, we're also seeing more monitoring put in place, although there's been a lot of rapid turnover in that office. They're trying to train up new. It's been more of a challenge for us, I think, across the board, for everyone who's trying to operate in commercial space to get it done. I won't say we're not getting our business done, we are, but it's quite a bit more onerous to get that work done that we'd normally gotten done.
I'm sure there are genuine security issues that ITAR needs to address when it comes to satellites, but to my mind it's a sledgehammer to crack a nut, and it's become a completely bureaucratic process that can't discern what is genuinely a security matter from what is just purely administrative. And we have an example recently where we were moving a facility. It was an intra-group transaction between SES companies, between NATO companies, but that triggered just a mass of ITAR clearances, having to get to various TAA amendments, and that, to my mind, that is it's not genuine security issues. It's purely a bureaucratic process. So what should be an intra-group matter becomes a matter for the US State Department to approve. We all know that there's no underlying issue. We have to go through the hoops involving all our vendors and a phenomenal, massive documentation. As you say, the State Department are not equipped to deal with it. There's a phenomenal backlog. So we had it on an expedited process, which still took, I think, 4 months. And I think people were pleased it took as quickly as that. Something is seriously wrong. And I think it's not just. We're looking that this all happened within Europe. So this was sort of completely sort of other than the fact that the satellites themselves being flown from the facility were US-made satellites. There wasn't an obvious, there wasn't a direct US nexus. And I know that the US industry, above all, are probably the biggest critics of those regulations. There was some very good reports that were issued. I think they were quite old now. Those Centre Strategic
CSIS.
Yeah, I thought they're excellent reports. I know they're a bit dated, but they really, I think, do an excellent job at examining the development of the ITAR regulations, why American industry is being punished and suffering from it. It doesn't do anyone any good, and why it really encourages non-American companies to really look for other solutions. So I don't think anyone really benefits. And really, I mean, those regulations are long overdue. They're trying to meet a perceived problem from a decade ago. I don't think they ever did deal with that problem. They certainly are just adding a phenomenal amount of aggravation now.
Yeah, the State Department processes some 60,000 license applications per year through their office, which is not a very large office, and there's only a few people in that office that have any specialty in space. And so now that's to say the 60,000 licenses are space licenses. I would say on the order of a few thousand that are focused on space in their entirety. But you've got people there who are overwhelmed with the work that they have to do and the workload in terms of the review. Now there is a new program called D-Trade that the State Department is implementing that goes into place on October the 12th of this year, which requires everyone who applies for a license to apply electronically. And I think that program will help in some ways in terms of the massive amounts of documentation that has to be transmitted between the various agencies for interagency review. So when state receives an application, they have to farm it out to the intelligence agencies and defense agencies and others to take a look at these and concur and sign off on the licenses. But squeezing the time in terms of transmittal between agencies and taking some of that slack out of the system really doesn't help you in terms of the review. And so the issue comes, what is on the U.S. munitions list, which is the list that defines what are ITAR-related products, and how do you deal with those products, particularly when you're dealing with NATO allies, or as we affectionately call it, NATO plus 8, which is NATO allies plus another 8 countries that are deemed, from a security standpoint, to be reliable allies of the United States. And there's been various measures where members of Congress have tried to seek special exemptions for that. In fact, in the Strom Thurmond National Defense Act that originally transferred authority back from the Commerce list to the state list, there was an exemption in monitoring requirements for NATO allies. But we still see it doesn't mean we don't see monitors. We do still see monitors because the State Department is their prerogative to say, on such and such campaign, we want to have a monitor. We had a monitor for a Mexican operator recently. In Peru, which was a surprise to us that Mexico was a grave threat, but needless to say, that's what the U.S. government felt. So I would agree with John. I think a number of these things that are being implemented because of the black letter law and the way that the products are defined under the USML, they remain under State Department control. We can talk, I don't know if the other panelists want to discuss this a little bit more, but we can talk about prescriptive actions that if you like in a bit.
And Chris, go ahead, you had a comment.
Thanks, Chris. Perhaps to just agree and amplify what my colleagues, John and Clayton, have just said, certainly from the perspective of MDA as a Canadian company, the recent developments in ITAR have not been a positive thing from a space industry point of view. And that's not to say that I disagree with the need for export control regimes, and we deal with them towards the Canadian government as well and other countries. But the U.S. ITAR restrictions have had have put a bit of a damper on some of our business with the U.S. in the sense that both from, say, the front end of the business, when we're developing new business in the U.S., it becomes a lot more difficult to have the discussions, to put together joint programs when you can't talk the technical details. And there is a TAA process where you can get approval to do that, but as was mentioned, that's a several-month process, so it does slow things down. But there's also an implication on the back-end delivery of programs, where we're finding, and this is something where the TAA process, from our perspective, has somewhat stabilized, and we know how to deal with that. There's a lag of a few months. We put in place the technical assistance agreements, and State Department approves it. We can do that end of the business. But when we're delivering space hardware, it's getting to be more onerous, the steps that have to be followed to be fully ITAR compliant. And we are doing those, but it adds an extra cost to the business that we do for the U.S. Customers. And in fact, even our suppliers in the U.S., and if we're building in Canada components, systems that have components from the U.S., some of our U.S. suppliers are now having to add extra charges onto our purchase orders to cover the costs of dealing with the applications and the administration associated with ITAR. So that's a negative for us. It increases the cost of our components unless we start to look outside the U.S. Negative from the point of view of the U.S. companies. And perhaps just to add a last anecdotal example how far it's really come. I bring the example of an international customer we have that we're under contract to now as a prime contractor to do a commercially funded deep space mission. We're proceeding with that work, and what's interesting is that a lot of this commercial funding comes from private investors inside the U.S. But the customer has asked us not to use any U.S. suppliers for any of the technology of this mission so as to avoid all the ITAR restrictions and constraints. And that's, I think, really a bit of a sad commentary from a space industry perspective, that those barriers are really being put in place that prevent really the closer cooperation we could have between international space companies. So.
And gentlemen, well, and how do we fix this? Easier said than done, isn't it?
Yeah. Now it's on. Perhaps you allow me as a lawyer to play a bit the devil's advocate here and also take a bit more long-term perspective if you ask how shall we solve that. The interesting thing is that from the international law perspective there's nothing wrong with ITAR. It's the supreme sovereignty of the United States to decide on its own export regulations, and if it wants to impose severe controls, so be it. An interesting note is that ITAR, of course, goes much further than some international arrangements which are in place, the multilateral trade control regime and the Wassenaar arrangements, which deal with dual use stuff, etc., amongst the United States, NATO allies, and a handful of other assorted nations, which, however, do still leave individual sovereignty with the states to decide on their own rules, and that the United States decides to go much further, so be it. And I, of course, understand that on the short-term perspective that creates problems, but my question would then be, doesn't it not lead in the long term to other states being able to develop the same capacities, and then you have a situation where the market is much more free to choose from all these various options. In other words, will not the walls of the water keep the ship from going further in the wrong direction, to sort of paraphrase a Dutch saying?
Anyone else? Art, you okay?
Hi. Well, I guess I represent the other side of the spectrum, the startup company that's trying to figure out how to make a certain amount of capital funding go a long way. And I tell you, when you do that, you want to avoid the United States, because it easily doubles the cost and doubles the time to do anything if you put a U.S. component into your critical path for any space system. And it's not just parts like secret parts or scanners or things you'd expect to be secret. They have this pernicious thing called defense services. Now, I asked what a defense service was, and I don't get an answer. Apparently, even if something is completely unclassified and available on the internet or in a public library, if I'm using it for space, I have to treat it as a defense service. Recently, I met with a major U.S. university, and they talked about fundamental research, and I looked at what they were doing and realized that what they were doing was delivering defense services, and told them, advised them as a lawyer, that they were going to have to get an agreement signed off by the State Department with their European partners. So this acts as a barrier to entry for U.S. startups. It's one of the reasons that our most recent startup is a European, a British, an Isle of Man company. We just got the first 2 licenses ever issued to a private company under the Missile Control Technology regime for dual-use reentry vehicles. And I'm sad to say it took 6 months even in Britain, but I can tell you that the second one took 20 minutes, which was remarkable. Of course, we had lunch with the fellow who was doing it. I think that the way to solve this is to do what President Bush is doing, and that's to put together a blue ribbon panel on how to take and increase American competitiveness by using the ITARs for the thing it was designed to do, which was to prevent traffic in arms, not to take and treat a person's graduate thesis as a weapon. And that effort is ongoing right now. They have some very good people on it. One of them, Sean O'Keefe, a former administrator of NASA and no lover of the ITARs. So I would call the ITAR, and I am registered with the State Department personally on this, so I have a reason to have an opinion. I'd call it the Foreign Technology Development Act, because all it's doing is causing other countries other than the U.S. to grow up a great crop of graduate students and have a lot of incentive to get into the market.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, just one comment perhaps. Perhaps more from the perspective of a user of the space laws or someone operating within them, not being a lawyer like many of my esteemed colleagues here. I can tell you that from an industrial perspective, we need to work within the ITAR regulations, and this is what we're doing. And the U.S. represents a large customer base for us, and we will continue to work in the U.S. One of the things that we're doing now to address this challenge is increase our operations in the U.S. We have a fairly large subsidiary in the U.S. that we're growing the size of, and we've put that behind a special security agreement, an SSA, that's approved by the DoD, which allows that entity to operate completely on the other side of the ITAR barrier. It means the communications between the corporate head office outside the U.S. and that subsidiary are somewhat restricted and are regularly monitored by a special committee that gets put together that reports to the Department of Defense. But it's one way that we're addressing the problem. It's a somewhat restrictive way, perhaps, but it's solving the problems a bit. But I agree with Art. The more that we can do to still meet the needs, the export restriction needs, and yet allow some of the space business to occur a little with a little less encumbrance would be very appreciated.
Well, and actually, Chris, that's a nice segue into the next question I had for the panel, and that's something that might not be too familiar to many in the audience, or it might be actually. It's the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, the Patriot Act of 2002. On one hand, you have the ITAR restricting technology in and out and people being able to do business in the United States. Again, why are we focusing? We're not just picking on the United States, by the way. It's really sort of one of the major market players in both satellite communications and obviously international space endeavors between agencies and contractors. And so on one hand, ITAR is restricting things, and then along pops up Sarbanes-Oxley. And I know a number of you have subsidiaries and are president and CEOs of subsidiaries in the United States. And have you seen any sort of impacts on your investors, on the way you're doing business, on your cost of doing business? I mean, one of the things that we've seen on the sort of other side of the barrier is a reluctance of people to actually invest in American companies because of Sarbanes-Oxley, or even especially with the share options. Gentlemen, anyone? Clay, please, go ahead.
Well, Arianespace is not a publicly traded company, so in fact it doesn't impact me directly, but I can tell you that a number of the companies we work with, particularly companies that are smaller firms, Analytical Graphics would be an example of a company that the folks I've talked to there, and they've testified on the Hill regarding the impact of Sarbanes-Oxley on smaller firms, they estimate that it's about 16 times more burdensome on a smaller company if your market cap is under $100 million a year to try to hire the accounting firms and do the kind of reporting that they need to do under these types of things. So I think it has been overall a big burden on smaller companies that don't have the standing armies of financial people and accounting firms doing oversight and reporting that some of the bigger firms automatically have in place. So it has been, I think, a major drag for a lot of these companies, particularly smaller firms in the space business.
I know when we acquired New Skies, it delisted from the New York Stock Exchange, and we could deregister from the SEC, and that had a significant benefit for the poor folks in The Hague who were dealing with Sarbanes-Oxley compliance, because it is even for the larger companies, it's a major compliance headache, and it has a significant cost, manpower ramifications. So, it's certainly one key factor. And if you have choice, I suppose, in your markets, then it's clearly going to be, I think, a significant factor. Having said that, I mean, we are seeing satellite space-related companies still listing. So there was World Space, Orbcom's planning to list, Global Star I see is planning to list. So it's still there's still space-related companies going there, but clearly they're going to have to factor in a very significant compliance cost. And the other thing is, of course, once you're there, it's not so easy to get away again. And I know that the SEC are looking at perhaps relaxing the rules for deregistering, and I think that I think would be very helpful if they did that, because at the moment once you're there, it's very difficult to avoid those obligations even if you cease your US listing.
Chris, just a thought. For those non-lawyers among us, it's perhaps worth explaining what the Sarbanes-Oxley is. My understanding it has to do with the restriction on individual shareholders having some liability that don't have the usual shareholder immunity from the liability from the operation of the corporation. But perhaps one of the lawyers could explain. And if I should also add, just to answer your question, we're listed on the Canadian Stock Exchange, so we're not directly affected by that.
Sarbanes-Oxley is a complex set of rules, but basically it boils down to the senior management taking personal responsibility, signing off on the financials of the company, saying that they're accurate and complete, and having a certain degree of personal liability. There can also be criminal liability attached to it. It's pretty onerous. I know one of the startups that we did commercialized part of a NASA unit, and we decided, our investors decided that they weren't going to bring money into the United States, and we had to create a Costa Rican subsidiary to bring the money in. So there are ways around this. It's simply a cost of doing business, but it's also a time, and it diverts your principal management away from other things they could be doing. There is a very real opportunity cost inherent in dealing with Sarbanes-Oxley that you simply have to ask yourself on a risk-reward basis if what you get in terms of better public regulation of your companies is worth the cost to those companies and to the society. It's very much a problem that Congress is going to have to solve.
And then moving to something, thank you, gentlemen. I'm moving to something a bit more general to everybody. Oh, sorry. Here we go. 1 second, sorry. Moving to something a bit more general for the topic is taking a larger pullback and looking at the Aerospace treaties and the Liability Convention. And I know there's been talk recently of maybe looking again at liability. There's been lots of questions coming from industry. As you know, space is treated very, very differently under international law and international treaty law through liability than any other sector in the world. And it has a big cost and a big impact on industry. It's one thing for the satellite operators and the launch vehicle chaps, but then some of the new startup companies as well. Virgin Galactic and others are now facing very large questions about how to handle liability issues and third-party liability. And I wondered if the panel had any views on liability and how to take things forward.
If revisiting the Liability Convention is something different from revising it, I would be all for it, because I think it is certainly not a perfect convention, but there is a lot of value in it, and while we should try to work on the things which are perhaps not picture perfect, I would principally propose to keep it in being for the time, certainly for the first number of years. The beauty of the Liability Convention is namely that there is a state liability regardless of who is the actual operator in outer space. And I think that's something which cannot be stressed too often, which means that it is up to the state, which can be considered liable, to then deal with any case where it's actually a private operator causing the event which causes the damage. And of course we increasingly see now issues in that direction. We see national space laws being developed where each time the governments are confronted with the very fundamental question, are we going to try to derogate all of the liability in case something happens to the private operator, to the licensee, or are we going to somehow cap that liability, which at the international level basically means that the government takes over or acts as a kind of reinsurer, or whatever way you want to put it. And I think that is a very beautiful thing for private space operators to keep in mind, unless the regime which is then implemented is going to be very, very strict or very tight. But perhaps my fellow panelists have other opinions on that, but I have the opinion that so far that has not been the major issue here. I think that ITAR is much more counterproductive in many respects to outer space. So in other words, the major issues to be worked on in context of the Liability Convention are not so much revising it or doing away with the public liability as making it a bit more sensible perhaps in its application. The current situation simply provides that once a launching state, always a launching state, and clearly the drafters of the convention did not take the possibility into consideration of sales in orbit or lease in orbit, where you get further away from the original launch partners.
I agree, I guess, mostly with what you said. I mean, it works today, and for operators like us, it's a good functioning system. I'm not sure that shifting all the liability to the commercial operators, and we are one of the commercial operators, makes sense. And it's not because of a self-serving reason. It's an issue of capacity now. There is more capacity now in the insurance market. We've seen a resurgence of capacity, but there have been times, particularly post 9/11, when you've seen capacity come out of that marketplace. And ultimately what you could do is end up straining capacity and increasing the premium rates and making it harder for all the commercial operators out there to do business. So I'm not so sure that that's a good approach. Although it's been proposed, I know the people looking at the regulations in the United States and the FAA reviewed that and whether or not it made sense, and Congress did that. In the United States, the liability regime has provisions where they have to reenact. I think it goes through 2009 now, I believe, before they have to re-up it again. I think on the personal, on the issue for Virgin Galactic and some of the guys in the personal spaceflight business, my personal opinion is that they've got more technology challenges than they do liability and risk sharing challenges right now. You know, obviously the people that are looking at these types of ventures and regulating that type of flight have grave concerns, both for the safety of the people that are going to sign up as citizen explorers or space tourists, if you will. I know they like to be called citizen explorers these days. But also with a vehicle like that flying over, in some cases, New Mexico or Texas or Oklahoma, or a lot of places where they've proposed having these types of spaceports, Dubai and even in I think Glasgow and Shannon are being considered in Europe. You've got some serious issues there. You're flying a rocket up over a populated area, and you want to be able to come down in a controlled fashion. And so there's serious concerns there. I know the smaller guys in the U.S. Struggled a bit with the FAA regulations and trying to promulgate some things, and they sought some help from Congress. And maybe it's because they're small and they don't have teams dedicated to this that they found it a bit challenging. But I think by and large, it's been successful in the efforts that they've put into place, and they've done a good job.
Well, Frans, I see your point, but I respectfully disagree. I think that we've got an act here that's almost an international act that's almost completely non-functional. In 30 years, there's really never been a claim under it. It isn't preventing much business because you can buy third-party liability insurance very cheaply. But it gives an extra layer of regulation to governments that like to regulate. The argument that, well, hey, it's international, so we ought to have state responsibility could equally be made for airlines or maritime traffic. I believe that in the United States what's going to happen is that we're going to get a liability regime through Congress, and it's going to supersede, for all practical purposes, the international regime. It's going to be a national law. And the U.S. government will take on the if you wish, insurance cap for space industry, just like it did for the nuclear industry under the Price-Anderson Act, where you buy as much third-party liability insurance as you have to under the national regulation, and then above that the state stands responsible. That's pretty much what happens now. But I think it doesn't make any sense at all to say that if an airliner crashes into a populated area that only the airline and its indemnifiers stand liable, but that if a spacecraft does the same damage, that somehow the whole weight of the state has to, unlimitedly be responsible for that. I just think it doesn't make sense. So I'm looking forward to national law superseding international law in that case.
Frans,
Thank you. Sorry, John, I had to react on that, of course. First of all, that there is no claim under the Liability Convention is obviously true, but I don't think that testifies to the uselessness of the Liability Convention as much as to the fortune that we have never had a major space accident so far. As to the U.S. national law possibly superseding international law, even as a non-U.S. citizen, I am aware that the U.S. Constitution puts the treaty law as the supreme law of the land, so I'm not sure whether it's possible to change that. But even so, even if it would be possible for the U.S. to step away from the Liability Convention, my preference for the Liability Convention to remain as it is in this respect is at least for the forthcoming perhaps decade or so. I don't agree or I don't disagree automatically that within 20 years we may revisit that. And that brings me to your point about airlines, because I don't think that's anyhow a comparable situation. Airlines are a commercial business since 60, 70 years almost, and precisely in the early days of the airline industry you could make a lot of comparisons to what is happening in spaceflight today. There was a reference was being made to space tourism, and I think there was an excellent paper in the ISL session by Ms. Yates on it, so I commend you to try and get hold of that and read it, which basically pointed out that in this context of the Liability Convention, the FAA currently takes a rather hands-off approach in terms of regulation in order to stimulate the industry, which is basically what happened in the airline industry 70, 80 years ago. So that when the space transportation industry, and then in particular private space transportation industry, will develop along the same lines and will become a commercial viable business, whether it's Virgin Galactic or Space Adventures, in perhaps 10 or 20 years' time, then I completely agree we should revisit it. But for the time being, I would still favor keeping it as it is.
I think the other sort of thing to note, I think, is that launching satellites today is obviously very much an international activity. So you will have maybe a company in one country procuring the launch from a company in another country, maybe with a launch in a third country, maybe into slot in a fourth country to be flown by a country by a company in a fifth country. So you have multiple states involved, and what we have found is that there's tremendous variation. Whatever the actual convention says, how it's implemented in countries varies tremendously, from quite often no implementation to partial implementation, and there is a lot of national variation. So maybe there is implementation insofar as it relates to the launch. In some cases it would cover the operation of the satellite as well. Obviously from our perspective, one of the biggest concerns that we face is where a country seeks to impose the full liability of the state on us. So we still have that, which I think is, to the point that you made, Art, I think is ridiculous, that the full weight should be borne by a commercial company. There is definitely issues. I'm not sure how much that relates to the convention per se and how it's sort of implemented. To my mind, it's more at the implementation stage where we need to work more.
Okay. Frans, I want to clear up one thing about the U.S. Constitution. The treaty and the federal statute are exactly co-equal under our Constitution. The later in time controls. So if we pass a federal statute that contravenes a treaty, it overrules the treaty as a matter of federal law. However, I really like your suggestion that we treat the development of spacecraft, particularly the kind I'm interested in that might carry tourists, like we carry aircraft, because if you look at the history of air transport, you find this wonderful convention called the Warsaw Convention that was adopted early in air transport for the specific purpose of limiting the liability of the air carriers. Certainly, I think we should adopt such a Warsaw Convention for space, and that it should limit liability to the same liability as for aircraft. It just flies higher and faster. But I guess just philosophically, I've got a problem with the state standing liable for my actions when I can buy commercial insurance for it. It may be a political thing.
And Frans, you have one final rebuff, and then we'll move to questions from the audience.
Yes, the reference to the Warsaw Convention was not totally unexpected, but it is important to realize that the Warsaw Convention is about passenger liability, contractual liability between the carrier and the passengers, and that may develop in due time in space transportation is quite likely, I must say. I mean, the current FAA regulations still allow space tourists flights operator to offer no liability coverage at all, but that will change, no doubt. But the Liability Convention is about third-party liability, and since in in aviation we do have an international convention on third-party liability, but it's hardly enforced, and most of the major aviation countries are not party to it, I would not recommend to follow that line. So that's my last point.
Thank you. And then also, I've been very remiss. I have forgotten to introduce our rapporteur, Moreni Pichler de Ortega, who has very kindly joined us from Madrid, who is a leading Spanish lawyer and will be taking notes for the publication today for us. And thank you, Moreni. My apologies. And also, as the note has told me, my name is Chris Stott, by the way, and I'm also the international representative of the Isle of Man government, the honorary representative of space affairs, also the president and CEO of ManSat, and an executive VP at Excalibur. And with that, we'll go to the audience for questions. Actually, sorry, Joanna, if you could please introduce yourself and make it a question, not a statement. That would be wonderful. Thank you. Go ahead.
School of Law and Director of the National Remote Sensing and Space Law Center. And I'm sorry, I have to make a very brief statement because I disagree with my good friend Art Dula, and I just don't want to leave the impression that there's a monolithic interpretation of American space law. And from my point of view, the Liability Convention has been a success precisely because there have been no claims. And in the Cosmos 954 case, it created this incentive for the Soviet Union to settle out of court with Canada. And I would consider not going to court a success in a self-help way. And the other comment I would make is about Sarbanes-Oxley. I live in Mississippi, the location of the United States' largest corporate failure in WorldCom and Bernie Ebbers. And I would suggest that the thousands of families in Mississippi that lost their life savings because of what happened at WorldCom would strongly disagree with your views.
Joanne, what views are you disagreeing with on WorldCom? I didn't understand that.
I heard you say that Sarbanes-Oxley is onerous, and what you are looking for is corporate responsibility. You have to weigh the risks. The risks that those people were never asked to take are just too high of a trade-off not to govern corporate activities. And I hope you'll still sponsor our space law competition in Mississippi.
I will still sponsor your space law award, don't worry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. Question in the front, sir.
Yes. Rules of the road for non-geo space. Stated otherwise, orbital traffic management for satellites. In geo world, it's taken care of by Kepler's law and the Wark 2-degree separation in slots. However, in the non-geo space, everybody has different orbits and they're all It's like a dodgem car in the amusement park. And don't we need some kind of rules of the road for satellites so that they will not interfere with one another or collide with one another, etc.? Some sort of standardization of orbits, I believe, is definitely necessary. And how do we get there? Who should be the regulatory agency that sets out the rules for standardization and so forth? I think that this is a problem that is with us now. There are hundreds of electronic interferences per day in non-geospace. Hey, let's wake up.
Gentlemen, orbital traffic management, especially in low Earth orbit, and any comments, any questions? I mean, any responses?
I'm sorry to take the floor again, but there is, to some extent, there is an international regime, because this is obviously also international, certainly if we talk about satellites and low Earth orbits. There is a regime which tries to deal with that, and that's the ITU. It doesn't deal with it by means of standardization, but there's a quite complicated and unfortunately often too bureaucratic and too long process in trying to arrange frequency coordination in order to avoid interference. Because interference is a nuisance for both the interfering and the interfered operator, so there is an inherent suggestion or impetus to try and solve that issue. But in an international framework which has, from an abstract lawyer's perspective, worked relatively well, except for the enormous time delays and specific problems with paper satellite applications. In the process of dealing with frequencies, also the orbital parameters have to be taken into account, because some orbits may interfere with other orbits depending upon the frequencies used and the other way around. And I'm not a technician, so if I talk nonsense, please say so. But this is the general situation, I think. So there is a regime, and there may be a need to revisit that and perhaps even revise it on certain major points. But there is at least something out there.
I might just mention that I'll be giving a paper tomorrow on this problem, and I'm a retired naval officer, and we do have rules of the road for the sea lanes, and also I guess there are rules for aerospace, airlines, and we certainly have rules for the traffic out here on the highways. So anybody is welcome to come and hear it. Oh, by the way, I didn't identify myself. Captain John Drame, U.S. Navy, retired.
I think there's another, besides the ITU, at the FCC and the Federal Communications Commission in the United States. They license these systems to operate. In fact, we went through a long rulemaking proceeding regarding deorbiting of satellites in low Earth orbit to make sure that the operators maintain enough fuel to actually deorbit the satellites once they're done with their useful life, so that they don't continue to populate the low Earth orbit orbits that they're in. They also obviously work on the frequency coordination issues, and by way of their virtue of licensing these systems to operate within the United States, have dealt with a number of the issues that you're talking about, which is which orbits you're operating in, how do you not collide or interfere with the other operator. Now, whether or not that's the right agency or not, it has fallen onto them, I think, just because of the jurisdictional issues relating to frequency coordination, but they've also taken it upon themselves with respect to issues like orbital debris and deorbiting spacecraft, both in the GEO and the LEO realm, to implement regulations to make sort of best practices in that area.
And actually, if I may swap my chairman's role for the ManSat role, working through the Isle of Man, and especially working closely with the UK, we do have strict rules about deorbiting satellites safely, especially up at GEO, etc. But that does, Clay, you mentioned it just now, that the question of space debris. And in my former life at McDonnell Douglas, clear launch windows are always an issue. I know there's been issues around the International Space Station. And should there be national laws looking after space debris? Should there be something else? Or what do you all think?
Well, certainly the FCC has put into place national laws with respect to the United States. for U.S. operators that are having their space systems licensed to operate within the United States. They have to comply with those regulations with respect to graveyard orbits or deorbiting satellites in low Earth orbit. I think a lot of the problems in low Earth orbit tend to relate more to upper stage engines that where they don't properly vent fuel and they create particles or other ways where there's been acts that haven't been maybe in the best interest of, we don't want to pollute the environment in which we all operate in. I know our company takes, we go to great lengths, and the Europeans that work with the European agencies that work with us make sure that we operate within the boundaries set in terms of how we work with our upper stages and dispose properly of the fuel, venting the fuel before to make sure that we don't have those types of catastrophes where you have an upper state exploding and creating lots of particles that create problems for others. So I'm not sure if there needs to be maybe further monitoring or not. It's not really my area of expertise, but.
No, well, thank you. No, and actually, one thing, I'll just make an observation. And if I get shot for saying this, it's okay, my government will look after me. One thing that we tend to find is the commercial industry takes incredible care not to create space debris. It goes to inordinate lengths and very expensive lengths to keep orbits and everything as clean as possible. But I would say, physician, heal thyself to the governments of the world, and not all the space agencies, but some of the larger ones, who create most of the space debris. And it's one of those reverse parallels that we find here on Earth, that industry goes to great lengths to do the right thing, and the governments tend to be rather naughty. Anyone else? I mean, actually, we'll have to slip this. This will have to be, I'm sorry, the time is running out. The last question that we have, the gentleman, actually, the lady behind you, sir, I am sorry. She's had her hand up for a long time. Sorry.
I'm Rachel Yates. I'm an attorney with Holland and Hart, a private law firm in Colorado in the U.S. My question for the panel is whether you are encountering any unique regulatory challenges in working with other emerging space countries or companies, including people in South America, Asia, or Africa.
Gentlemen?
Well, I think it's fair to say that every country presents its own challenge, and every country has its own way of permitting space satellite services. The Americas have one model, which tends to be the, typically referred to as landing rights. So you can't provide satellite services in many of the countries in the Americas without getting an upfront license. So that's one model. So there's a certain amount of pain getting that, and maybe requirements for local entities, JVs, local partners, so that there may be all sorts of grief. But once you have it, you then know that you're there. Outside the Americas, by and large, I haven't seen that in Europe, Africa, or Asia. So they have a different model. So there, it would be very much the local operator with the Earth station getting the necessary licenses, or for the services. And yeah, I mean, there can be huge issues there. I mean, it can range from Europe, which is very free. So in Europe, you can provide a satellite service pretty freely. So as long as there's no frequency coordination issue, you can provide the service. You don't need landing rights per se. Certainly in some Asian countries, there can be all sorts of problems. So satellite frequency coordination can be used as a reason why you can't provide a service. There's preference for domestic operators. You can't sell your service other than through a domestic operator. So yeah, there's a host of issues, a host of challenges, and a country may well have signed up to the WTO, and that may include satellite services on the face of it, but you find that's what on the face of it, but in practice it's very different, and providing satellite services into certain countries can be effectively prohibited. And I think that's partly because satellites are a funny thing. They not only provide telecommunication services, which are typically covered by the WTO, but they also provide media broadcast services, which typically are outside. So we can be in a very difficult area.
Answering the question, perhaps, I think you said from emerging countries or emerging industries, and perhaps I'm interpreting it a little bit broader, your question, but if it's a question about emerging industries, one of the big ones is the resource industry, which is starting to have some interest in space. And there is a very big challenge, legal challenge that we face. And what we're finding in our discussions with members of the resource industry that are generally well-funded and will be willing to invest in space is a legal concern about ownership. So if you wanted to do helium-3 mining on the moon, are you going to own it if you bring it back, or are you going to, if you like to extract some platinum group metals from a passing asteroid? Those are expensive things to do, and the questions that are being asked are, if we provide the funding for this, how do we know that legally we will actually own what we're bringing back? And so that's perhaps a challenge for the international legal group as a whole that we look at, and if we really want to open up the future of space, we need to address some of those ownership issues, I think, from a legal perspective as well.
Just one point, that was a number of the customers that we deal with, satellite operators that are working in developing and emerging markets around the world, currently see a very bright issue now with respect to the use of C-band satellite capacity. A lot of these countries want to implement WiMAX systems to be able to leapfrog and provide internet to rural areas and even urban areas in their countries, which of course is a laudable goal, and I think one that a lot of the companies would want to use, and satellite could do a lot of the backhaul for that. The problem is that a lot of these WiMAX guys want to operate in the C-band systems where traditional broadcast satellite services have been operating in, and it's going to come to a head, I think, at the upcoming ITU meetings as it plays out. And it is a bit of the sort of haves and have-not kind of debate, but it's something that's troubling, I think, to a number of the operators and manufacturers who build the spacecraft that we launch, to be able to try to preserve the capability of satellites to provide, particularly satellite news gathering and other things, the broadcast industries that depend on that C-band capacity, that it's not interfered with spurious emissions from the WiMAX.
Chris, with regard to who owns the moon, well, I can't think I can answer that question, but if you go up there and spend your private money and you remove the minerals from being in place or beneficiate them in any way, the current law of the United States is that you own them, because the Apollo lunar samples are owned by the U.S. government. I know this came up when we started to incorporate on the Isle of Man, and the Isle of Man government actually put out a tender through Chris's office for a new space law, and our firm responded to that and wrote a Space Resources Act, which is currently going through the legislature on the Isle of Man. I do expect within the next few months to few years that we'll have positive black letter law that says you can have the right to own minerals that are not in place or that are beneficiated in space. If we don't have this, we'll never be able to accumulate the capital or lay off the risk necessary to develop these wonderful resources for everybody.
Oh, John, and then Frans.
Sorry, just so I should give a plug actually, because for developing proprietary rights in space, there is of course the Unitwha space protocol, and that's really never got off the ground, if you excuse a pun, because I think if you're interested in it, we can point you in the right direction. It's something which I think is a very good, potentially a good initiative that probably needs more support and some key backers, but potentially it could develop like, as it did for aircraft leasing, a similar sort of proprietary framework for space law, proprietary rights in space.
Thank you. I'd like to react to Art's statement, and I do not necessarily disagree with the latter part of it. As a matter of fact, I think we should certainly develop a regime which is clear on that. As a matter of fact, there was a major conference in Montreal last June which inter alia addressed this issue. But as to the first point, it may well be that in an American law you may own the moon, but American law does not apply to the moon in the first place, because Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, to which the US, to my knowledge, is still a party, clearly states that there is no national appropriation of the moon by sovereignty or any other means, and that can only mean that US law on a territorial basis cannot apply to the moon. Even a statute, a later statute in the US could perhaps overrule the internal effects of that obligation, but as long as the United States is still a party to the Outer Space Treaty, to all the other countries parties to the treaty, it is obliged to adhere to that rule. Now again, coming back, I think that indeed there is a need for a regime to allow without any legal doubt, ownership over minerals certainly once exploited, and perhaps even previously to being exploited in terms of focusing on the investments there. But it is not necessary so far to link that to ownership over territory. We have been able to fish the high seas for centuries without any state or private company ever owning part of that.
No, thank you, Frans. And actually, this will draw a close to our things today. But I think Art didn't say that America owned the moon, just the parts they brought back. I think otherwise our friends from Russia and the CIS would actually have a very good claim, having been up there first. But gentlemen, thank you for today. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your questions. I hope you'll join me in a round of applause to say thank you for these gentlemen from coming from around the world to do this.